freedom throughout all the wars. There are seven names on that memorial from the Battle of Fort Velasco. And I honestly, 2 years ago, had absolutely no clue about Fort Velasco or the Battle of Fort Velasco. But it intrigued me that 7 men from Brazoria had died over here in the battle. And so I began to do some research. And this past Memorial Day, I told their story. And so Dortha heard about it, and so she asked me to come over and tell the story here today. Before I do, I just want to say a word about history, because I will be the first to admit that I am not a professional historian. I'm interested in history, in particular United States history, Texas history, because I personally believe that if we forget our history, then we lose a big part of who we are. And if you forget who you are, then you don't know where you're going. If you forget where you come from, then you're never going to figure out where you're going. And one of the reasons I think that we're so messed up in this nation today is we've forgotten who we are. And so it's a privilege for me to be with you today and to talk about these events that happened 185 years ago, beginning basically tomorrow. In fact, right now, 185 years ago, those men from Brazoria were headed down here with some cannon on a ship, and they were looking for a fight. What caused me to research this again was to ask that question: why would 7 men from Brazoria, Texas, pick their rifles up and travel about 25 miles down the Brazos River to Fort Velasco here and attack it and fight and die? That was the question that I posed to myself, and started doing the research to find out. And it turns out that the story is quite a bit larger than that. What I'm going to do is just basically tell a little bit of the background story, and then just a little bit about these two guys. But so most of this history, you folks may already know all of it. And if you do, I apologize. Again, I'm still kind of a newbie to all this, and so I'm just going to tell you what interests me. The answer to that question of why these men would take their rifles up and come down here and fight begins a little over 10 years before 1832, when this battle was fought. In December of 1821, when Stephen F. Austin brought the first colonists here to the land grant that he had been granted by the government of Spain. Now, Austin actually had gotten that land grant from his father. His father had died before he could fulfill it. Stephen F. was not honestly interested in being an impresario, but his mother kind of pressed him into it. And so in December of 1821, he brought the first of what came to be known as the Old 300. He had a contract to settle 300 families in this area between the Brazos and the Colorado River, all the way up, and I don't even, at this point, don't even know how far up it went. Some of you may know. But he settled the first settlers here, and over the next 10 years or so, he brought in almost all of those 300 families, and all of this became the Austin colony. Now, Austin offered these settlers who were coming from the United States, he offered them land at basically 12.5 cents an acre, which was 10% of what they could expect to buy land for in their homes, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas. And so they were coming for cheap land, and they were promised that if they would come and settle this land and produce on it, if they had 2 years to make it produce. If they didn't, if it wasn't productive in 2 years, then they had to give it back. But they were promised that they would be free from tariffs and duties on anything that they brought in and anything that they shipped out for at least 10 years. They also promised to become Mexican citizens, because about the time that Austin began this endeavor of bringing colonists here, Mexico won its independence from Spain. And so his impresario contract transferred over to the Mexican government, and they agreed to honor it for him to bring these 300 settlers in. over the next 5 or 6 years, the number of Anglos in this area increased dramatically. In fact, it increased so much that the Mexican government began to fear that perhaps the United States was going to try to annex Texas. In fact, as early as 1825, the United States government was making inquiries with the Mexican government to buy part or all of what was coming to be known as Texas. And the Mexican government didn't want to sell. And so they had all of these colonists here that had promised to be Mexican citizens, although their loyalties were somewhat suspect. If you were the Mexican government, you weren't sure where these folks' loyalties lie. Also, they had instructed Austin that, and this is kind of the religious angle, that he should only bring Roman Catholics in, because Mexico is a heavily Roman Catholic country. And they pretty much didn't pay any attention to that at all. Most of the folks coming over here were Protestant. And so Mexico began to worry about what was going to happen if too many of these American citizens moved to Texas. And so in 1830, in fact on August the 6th, 1830, Mexico, the government of Mexico passed a series of laws that limited or restricted immigration from the United States. In fact, they basically made it illegal. They didn't put up a fence. I think this is all kind of ironic because of what's currently going on between Mexico and Texas. But they didn't put up a fence, but they basically said, we don't want any more of you people over here. Also, on those impresario contracts, and an impresario was just someone who promoted immigration. And so they actually canceled all those unfulfilled contracts. Now, if you had come and you had gotten your land and you had settled on it and you had made it produce and it became yours, you were able to keep it. But if the contract was unfulfilled, that is, if you had not received title of that land, they canceled that, and so you were not going to get that land. And so basically they told folks, don't come anymore, we're not giving you any more land. Now, this didn't set very well with folks around here. There were still people coming from the United States, some of them coming to work the land, some to do to open stores and those type of things. But what these laws also did, besides restrict immigration, these laws also set up duties or tariffs for anything that was coming in and anything that was going out. Up until this point, you could, when you moved here, everything that you brought with you, you didn't have to pay taxes on anything that you produced and shipped out. And most of the things from this area were shipped out of the Brazos River, out of the Trinity River, out of the Colorado River, and was taken over to New Orleans and sold. And there was absolutely no duty or tariff on it up until 1830. In 1830, the law said, now you're going to start paying taxes. And it probably is not a great stretch of the imagination to imagine that those folks enjoyed paying taxes about as much as you and I enjoy paying taxes. So all of these laws began to anger the populace. On top of that, the government opened up a series of duty stations or forts. Fort Velasco was one of them, opened in 1832. At the mouth of the Trinity River, the first one was placed there in Galveston Bay, and it came to be known as Fort Anahuac. And Anahuac, or the garrison there at Anahuac, was charged with inspecting everything going in and out of up and down the Trinity River and charging duty on that. At this point, I might also mention that Anahuac was garrisoned by about 100 Mexican soldiers. But many of these soldiers were convicted felons from Mexico. In fact, if you were convicted of a crime in Mexico, but you agreed to join the military, they would expunge your record, or they would absolve you of your crime. So many of the soldiers that were sent up here to man or to garrison these forts were actually criminals. And as a result of that, the crime rate in the area skyrocketed. Again, something that the colonists were very upset about and deeply troubled. So in 1830, you have Anahuac. Now, the commander of the fort at Anahuac was a man by the name of of one Davis Bradburn, or John Bradburn. He had been an American citizen. He was born in the United States, but he had come to Mexico. He had ultimately received his citizenship. He was almost kind of like a soldier of fortune, and he became a colonel in the Mexican army. They sent him up here to take command of Fort Anahuac. Bradburn, it turns out, was, I don't know exactly how to describe him. The word tyrant comes to mind. He certainly was not a people person. He often exercised his power and authority over the colonists in an arbitrary manner. He would arrest and hold citizens without charges, and he basically was the military law. And in his mind, he was, in his mind, he was pretty much it. In May of 1832, in fact, let me back up just a minute, because that fort in Anahuac was established in 1830. This fort here in Velasco was established early in 1832. And the commander at this fort was a Mexican officer by the name of Domingo de Ugartequea. And I think I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, again, I'm just an amateur here. But he actually was a fairly competent commander. And he was in command of this fort when the attack happened. But in May of 1832, this fort was already in place. At Anahuac, Bradburn arrested a lawyer by the name of William Barrett Travis. Now you recognize that name because a couple of years later he's going to be in command of a little mission down in San Antonio called the Alamo, and he's going to lose his life down there. But Travis was a lawyer, and he was representing a slave owner from Louisiana. Slavery was legal in the United States, of course, at this point. It was illegal in Mexico. Now, many of these colonists who came to Texas brought their slaves with them because Austin selected, he was able to select his colonists, and he routinely chose those who had means and who could make something of this land, and that's the reason that I think Texas became what it was. But many of these also owned slaves, and they brought their slaves with them. But slavery was illegal in Mexico. And Bradburn, the commander of the post there at Anahuac, he made it known that any runaway slave that came to him, he would protect, or he would not turn back to his owner. Well, Travis was representing a man from Louisiana who had some runaway slaves that Bradburn was protecting. And so some negotiations happened, and evidently at some point in the negotiation, Travis mentioned, or perhaps a letter was produced, that there was a militia in Louisiana that was going to come and get those slaves if Bradburn didn't let them go. Okay? There's some reports that perhaps Travis forged that document, because evidently there never was a militia. At any rate, it never came. And or whether he just made a verbal threat, the record is just a little bit unclear. But what is clear is that Bradburn arrested Travis on charges of sedition and insurrection. And those charges were punishable by death, by firing squad. Now, Travis had a business partner named Patrick Jack. And Patrick Jack was upset that his partner Travis had been arrested. And so he made some threats against Colonel Bradburn as well. So Bradburn had him arrested. So now you've got two men sitting in prison over in Anahuac, and the charges are sedition and insurrection, and they're punishable by death. There were many attempts to try to get them released, to get these two men released, or at least turned over to civil authority. Bradburn would not do that. He insisted on trying them in criminal court. Patrick Jack had a brother named William, and William was a judge in the Austin colony. William came up to Anahuac to try to get his brother free and Mr. Travis free, and he was unsuccessful, so he set out with a couple of other guys through the Austin colony to recruit support
fact, he was asking men to get your rifles and come over to Anahuac. He made it over to Brazoria, and he persuaded 90 men from Brazoria to get their rifles. There was a man over there by the name of John Austin, no relation to Stephen F. Austin, although he had been with Austin down in Mexico City, and he was one of the original of the old 300. But John Austin took command of these 90, and they came over to Anahuac. They were joined by about 70 or 80 other men, so that there was a force of about 160 or 170 men over at Anahuac, ready to attack if they didn't get the freedom of those two, of Travis and Patrick Jack. Well, Bradford was going to negotiate with them. He said, I tell you what, he said, if you'll back off 6 miles and you'll give me a chance, I will release these prisoners. So, and if you agree not to attack. So they backed off to a little place called Turtle Bayou. And they waited. Bradburn reneged on his agreement. He actually sent some couriers to some of the other forts asking for reinforcements, because he had about 80 men at that time against probably a force of about 180. So he started asking for reinforcements. The reinforcements never came. There was a brief skirmish as some Mexican soldiers came out of the fort and they were attacked, and a couple of guys were killed. And then Bradburn withdrew back into the fort, and he said, I tell you what, if you want those guys, you can come get them. Now, at Turtle Bayou, these colonists were trying to decide what to do, because they understood if we attack this fort, we're basically attacking the Mexican government, and this is pretty much it. They formed a committee, and they decided to draw up a series of resolutions that explained exactly why they were doing what they were doing. The committee was charged with this, and I need to quote this. They were charged with to draw up a preamble and resolutions declaratory of the wrongs and abuses committed by the chief magistrate, that would be Bradburn, of the nations, and his minions of the army, and also of the determination of Texas to repeal further aggressions by the military and to maintain their rights under the Constitution of 1824. Now, they produced this document that came to be known as the Turtle Bayou Resolutions, and if you're interested in, it's a very interesting document. I don't have time to go into it, but I would encourage you maybe to look that up sometime. Well, after these resolutions were adopted, it was decided that they were going to attack Anahuac, but they decided they needed some more firepower, because John Austin basically was in command of the men there. He was aware that there were 3 cannon back at Brazoria. 2 of them were owned by, and I was talking to these guys out here, and I wasn't sure what size of cannon they were. Evidently they were 6-pounders. There was a 9-pound cannon here at Fort Velasco. They had 2 6-pounders in Brazoria that were owned by individuals who basically used them in their shipping interests, because when they were taking goods down the river and across the Gulf of Mexico, there were pirates and those type of things. So they had cannon to help protect their shipping. There was also a little schooner tied up at Brazoria at this time, and the name of the schooner was the Brazoria. It also had a cannon on it. And so there was 3 cannon back in Brazoria. The men at Turtle Bayou decided to send back to Brazoria to retrieve those cannon. And so John Austin and several other men made the trip from Anahuac back to Brazoria. And when they got there, the citizens of the community called a town meeting to decide whether or not they were going to go to war. Now, there had already been some rumblings about war, about fighting, and in fact, the month before, John Austin had asked for volunteers to go down and attack Fort Velasco, but they had voted him down, and so now he was standing there with these men, telling them what was going on at Anahuac, and the entire town gathered for a town meeting. And they discussed it, and they decided to appoint a committee of 5. So they appointed 5 men to decide what they were going to do. These men decided that they should go to war. It was taken to the entire town, and the entire town of Brazoria voted to release the cannon and to basically go to war. I believe, and I am a Brazoria person, so I am a homeboy, but I believe that Brazoria can be counted on as the first ones to go to the fight.
Always.
Now, if you know anything about people from Brazoria today, that probably wouldn't surprise you. But so on the morning of June the 22nd, and so this is 1832, and this is June 24th. The battle actually began on the 25th. So here we are 185 years later. On the morning of June the 22nd, these 3 cannon were loaded onto this schooner, a little 24-foot schooner called the Brazoria. And about 120 men from Brazoria agreed to go with Austin to reinforce the folks at Anahuac. They decided the best way to get that cannon over to Anahuac was to put it on that schooner and sail it down the Brazos River and then across over to Galveston Bay, where they would use it for attack. Now, Austin understood or believed that Ugutequea, the commander of the fort here at Velasco, probably was not going to let him pass. My feeling is that probably he was hoping he wouldn't let him pass so that he could knock this fort out. Because remember, Austin had a store in Brazoria, and everything that he tried to bring in or take out was being taxed by the folks that were manning this here port. They stopped every ship, and they inspected the cargo, and then they charged duties and the tax. And these folks didn't like paying that tax. So if he could get rid of this fort, he was looking for it, and John Austin was the man who wasn't afraid of a fight. 40 of the men got on the schooner Brazoria, and it began to sail down the Brazos River. The other 80 or so began to march overland, the 25 miles from Brazoria here to Fort Velasco. They sent a 4-man party ahead of them, and they came up to the fort, and they informed the colonel that they were going to sail the Brazoria Pass, and he was not going to stop and inspect it. Well, he knew what was going on, and he knew that the cannon was on board, and so he obviously refused. He said, "You're not going to sail it by here, or you're going to sail it by over my dead body." And so the guy said, "Well, I tell you what, that'll be just fine with us." So anyway, on the 25th of June, this force arrived on the river here, just right outside the fort. The Brazoria itself was moored about 150 yards upriver from the fort, with the 3 cannon on board trained at the fort. Again, the fort itself had a 9-pounder. The force, or Austin divided his force into 2. One part of the force came around from the beach side. There was a little more cover that way, and they made their way toward the fort after dark on the 25th. And then Austin brought the rest of the men around the north side, and they attacked from this way. They didn't have much cover. They actually were using cedar logs in kind of a makeshift palisade to protect themselves, although it turned out to be not too much protection. One of those little cedar palisade, portable palisade, after the battle was over, had 130 bullets in it, and it was pretty much riddled. And as the battle ensued, they actually began to dig in and for some protection. Anyway, about 10 o'clock on the night of the 25th, the battle began. And the Brazoria opened fire. The fort began to fire on the Brazoria. It wasn't too long before its mooring lines were cut. It actually ended up running aground just over here on the river. The battle ensued basically all night. It was a very fierce battle. The firing incessantly for about 6 to 7 hours, and these men just sat there and shot at each other. About 30 minutes after daybreak on the 26th, battle's still raging and it starts to rain. It doesn't just start to rain, it starts to rain hard. I don't know exactly what was going on, but the folks around here said they'd never seen rain like that before, okay? So it was evidently coming down in buckets. As a result of that, the colonists backed off, and the battle actually stopped at that point. That day, after the rain stopped, Takea came out under a white flag, and he said, I'll tell you what, I will, he was basically out of ammunition at that point, and besides the fact, these Mexican soldiers, who many of them were criminals from Mexico, were also cowards and weren't really interested in fighting anyway. And so he knew he was pretty much done. So he came out and offered to surrender the fort if he was allowed to march out with his soldiers and all of their arms and all their ammunition and all their stores and full military honor. Well, Austin wasn't having any of that. He said, you guys can leave, but you're not going to take your arms with you. So both sides went back and prepared for the next part of the battle. But they didn't fight all that night, and the next morning, which now would have been the 27th, they got back together, and this time the colonists said, okay, you can keep your arms, you can have full military honor, if you'll just march out and surrender the fort. And so that's exactly what happened. So Takea and his men left. They were offered the use of the Brazoria, except the Brazoria had been so badly damaged in the bombardment from the fort that it was basically unseaworthy, and so they weren't able to use it. And so Takea marched his forces south. They also had to agree not to come back and fight against the Texans again. Just one little side note. Now, in fact, let me just say, during this fighting, there were 5 Mexican troops that were killed. And 16 were wounded. The colonists lost 7 killed and 14 wounded. And all these men, to my knowledge, were from Brazoria. The 7 killed certainly were. The names of those killed were Captain Alet Buckner and his Mexican servant Jose, a man by the name of Andrew Castleman, Matthew Pines, Edward Robertson, William S. Smith, no relation that I know of, Leancer Woods. Now, just one side note or interesting story. One of these men killed, and I haven't figured out exactly which one yet, was the mate of the Brazoria. When the men decided they were going to use the Brazoria to transport those cannon, they didn't have anybody to sail the ship. And the guys who could sail the ship were like, we don't want anything to do with the fighting. But the mate of the Brazoria was allowed to come, or he said he would sail the ship if he didn't have to fight. And so it was agreed upon that when we get down there, you won't have to fight. So he sailed the ship down here, tied it up, and then he went below decks. But one of the cannonball from the cannon here at Fort Velasco crashed in through the side of the ship and killed him. So he was one of the casualties of the battle at Fort Velasco. So after the battle's over now, and the Brazoria is not seaworthy, so the men decide they're going to take those cannon and they're going to transport them overland up to Anahuac to continue the siege up there. But before they could leave, they found out that Bradburn had resigned and he had left, someone else had taken over, and Travis and Patrick Jack had been released, and so there was no reason for them to go up to Anahuac and fight, so they went home to Brazoria. And that basically is my story. Now, I want to go back just real quickly to the original question, because I've thought an awful lot about this. Why in the world would not just these 7 men who were killed, but the 120 to 150, and the estimate is somewhere between 120 and 150 men from Brazoria, why would they take up arms on June 25th and 26th, 1832, travel 25 miles down the Brazos River, and attack Fort Velasco? Why would they do that? Well, here's the answer I came up with. They went for their families and they went for their future. They went because things like justice and honor and duty and country are more than just words. They went because sometimes free men have to fight in order to stay free. They have to fight for their freedom. They have to stand up. There are times when people have to stand up and say to the powers that be, no more. We're not going to take this anymore. The Battle of Fort Velasco was the first battle that became known as the struggle for Texas independence. And it was less than 4 years later that many of these same men from Brazoria stood with General Houston over at a place called San Jacinto, and they welcomed the birth of a new nation. And my prayer is that their struggle will never be forgotten. And that people like you and me will also stand up.